Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to tonight's inaugural professorial lecture. My name's Joy Carter and I'm the Vice-Chancellor, and it's my huge pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for this very special event. We're a university that's driven by social justice, passionate about sustainability, defined by our care for all life and the planet. I'm really privileged to work with colleagues who aren't only leading experts in their fields, but passionate, values-driven people as well. They work at the forefront of their subject areas, not just for their own advancement, but for the greater good. And they leave a mark, not just locally, but globally. They make a difference to the world around us. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Carole Parks this evening. She is someone who epitomises what I've just described. Carole is Professor of Responsible Management and Leadership. Her passion for justice goes right back to her family of origin, and this continues in her own family today, all making their own contributions to making the world a better place. It's delightful to welcome them with us today. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how Carole got to be sitting on the front row in this lecture theatre tonight. And we're going to start with where she grew up, on a council estate in Birmingham. Her parents were both very strong role models in terms of work ethic and, interestingly, their own passion for social justice too. Carole's parents both worked in the car industry, and her mother became a union representative. She fought similar battles to the Dagenham Ford women in the 1960s, and she took part in the Battle of Saltley Gate, fighting for the rights of miners in the 1970s. Carole went to the local grammar school, and she later secured a place at Birmingham University to do business studies. But university was relatively foreign in terms of a concept to Carole and the community she grew up in. So she didn't enter university straight away. Instead, she went into a job within the NHS in their HR department. This started Carole on an amazing journey spanning both the professional and academic worlds and involving many years of part-time study. So first of all, the NHS. In the NHS, Carole was responsible for managing the staff for the opening of a new hospital, and she did the same for Sainsbury's in the opening of new stores. She eventually ran their management development programmes. But all of this formed a gateway into Carole's academic life, with a post opening up at the University of Wolverhampton. From Wolverhampton, where she was head of department, Carole moved to Aston University, where she became Director of Social Responsibility and Sustainability, a big university-wide role. In this role, driven by a passion for fairness and justice still, and inspired, interestingly, by local advocates for ethical business, such as Sir Adrian Cadbury, Carole became a leading figure in the field of business ethics, responsibility and sustainability. And that's the field she's known for and celebrated for today. So how did she come to be at Winchester? Well, we captured Carole 2 years ago. I've never told her that, but it rather feels to me like we captured her and brought her here. She led our application to become a UN Principles of Responsible Management Education, or PRIME, Global Champion. Carole has also been a driving force behind the university's work in the field of climate change education. This is really important for us here, and we aim to involve every single one of our students, educating the next generation about sustainability and climate change. At Winchester, Carole chairs the Responsible Futures group that partners with the NUS to embed sustainability across the university. Carole's work has been recognised internationally at the highest levels. Just last year, at the 10th anniversary of the Prime Global Forum United Nations reception, Carole was presented with a prestigious award, a Prime Pioneer Award by the UN. This was for her leadership and commitment to the development of PRIME, the Principles of Responsible Management Education. She was also appointed, and this is important as well, very prestigious too, as a special advisor to the UN for Prime. We're really proud of those appointments, Carole, really proud of them. And lastly, a little known fact about Carole. Am I allowed to tell them about your cake baking? She's a champion cake baker with awesome, breathtaking creations that have to be seen to be believed. Carole, you are a hugely valued and important part of our university community, and we're endlessly, endlessly thankful for the huge contribution you make to this institution. And also, we're really proud of your relentless passion for justice. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Carole Parks.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Joy. You didn't tell me you were going to say about the cake, so I'm glad you just didn't have the pictures, but there you go. So thank you and welcome, and I'm so pleased to see so many of you here tonight, and particularly my very valued colleagues, both former and current colleagues, and of course my family that I'm really pleased to have been able to join me this evening. Tonight, I'm going to be talking, as the title suggests, about responsible business and management education. And there's a question in irresponsible times, and I'll come on to that question in a moment. So it's going to take 3 sections, really. I'm going to talk a little bit about my life and my values, and some of it you've heard from Joy already. The work in various areas, but particularly now in responsible management education, and a little bit more about my inspirations for that. And then to talk about the challenges that we all face in the world today. And then look at how responsible management education and Prime and the University of Winchester are addressing those challenges. So Joy has already introduced the principles for responsible management education. As you can probably gather from the 10th anniversary last year, that it was set up in 2007. And our colleague Alan Murray was actually involved in the original task force, and he and I joined in the first global forum in 2008. And that date was significant because some of you may recall there were major events going on around the world, and we'll come back to that at that time in 2008 in finance and economics, particularly affecting the business world. So as Joy says, these are my roles internationally, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the group on the working group on the challenge of poverty as well, because it's going to take 3 themes, I guess, in terms of those challenges, which is to do with the environment and climate change, with the role of education, and the fighting poverty and fighting for inclusion in management education and higher education more generally. And I've also been the recent chair of the UK and Ireland Prime chapter. We have had a stranglehold on that title, with Alan starting off, and then I took over the last 4 years. And we actually grew the chapter from 7 signatories way back in 2007 to 70 universities that are part of this now. Alan and I spent a lot of our early time on the Prime journey before all that, going around various places in the country, trying to encourage people to be members of that. And as Joy said, we're now Prime champions, and we've had, will be our 3rd and then 4th year as Prime champions, which is one of 38 universities globally, and only 5% of the universities that are signatories to Prime will be Prime champions. I thought I'd just kind of get out what we mean by responsible management before I go into it, because everyone will have their own definition and everyone will have their kind of own take on it and take it in different things. This is a kind of version that I use in many different ways to try and explain, that it's not just one thing, it's actually a range of things, and it's actually trying to look at issues of governance of organisations, issues relating to ethics, which I talked about, the economic viability, because obviously without the viability of organisations economically, we can't provide jobs and have growth in terms of services and so on. And social responsibility, environmental sustainability, including climate change, and then some of the things that I'll touch on, which is poverty and wealth creation and human rights and workers' rights. And in fact, those two are particular passions of mine, because the work I did for my PhD was actually on human rights, and I'll talk a little bit about that when I'm onto it. So back to the question of the lecture, responsible or irresponsible. So I thought I'd start as a good academic with some definitions of what responsibility means. And there was a range of things that came up, and I think most of those we can relate to as understanding what responsibility means. The bottom one, I think, is actually very powerful and goes to the heart of what we think about in terms of responsibility or irresponsibility. And then when I was thinking about irresponsible times, are we living in times that are more irresponsible than previous times? And you know, that's a question for you to think about, because we tend to think of the current things that are affecting us. But as we'll see, there are things that have gone on for decades. But are we at a tipping point in terms of some of the challenges that we face where they can no longer be ignored? So I'll talk about some of those in terms of the social issues, the economic, the environmental, and also, of course, the political. With the social, and it's a vast area, of course, but one of the things I wanted to highlight is the issue of inequality. And when 1% of the world owns half of the wealth in the world, is actually, and then 99% of the rest of the world have the other 50%. And that gap gets wider and wider. And the effects of that inequality, and I'm going to come back to that. This is actually from the spirit level, the Equality Trust, which is Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, who I actually worked with in a project in Birmingham that I'll talk about later in the talk. And then when I was thinking about political challenges, I was trying to think of a graph or a picture or something that might encapsulate that. And I had several options. But for some reason, I just kept coming back to this picture that I couldn't get out of my head. It was kind of like being drawn to it, like a moth to a flame almost, you know. And you know, that's it's easy to kind of highlight some of the things that have happened, particularly in relation to the gender I'm talking about with regard to this, the change of leadership in the US. But there have been kind of quite significant changes. And I remember we had an interview with the editor of the Times Higher, who actually said to me, you know, well, isn't this all going to be for nothing in terms of the Paris Agreement if Trump's not, you know, ratifying it? And well, actually, it probably doesn't make any difference, because there were only 3 countries. I was actually in Paris as part of the higher education, and there were only 3 countries at that point in November 2015 that didn't sign up to the agreement, and that was Nicaragua, Syria, and then, that they all signed up apart from Nicaragua and Syria, and then later the ratification, there were 3 countries outstanding, the 2 I've mentioned, and then the US. And now Syria and Nicaragua have both signed, so we only have the US. And there's a big movement in the US called We're Still In, which is most of the major cities and most of the major states. So in terms of the Paris Accord and the Paris Agreement, that's why I say that, you know, that might know. But I don't want to dwell on, I think he gets enough publicity anyway. So, so let's move to the business and economic. And this is something I often talk to students about, using images of logos. And what do those logos instill in you when you see them? Is it a sense of, yes, they're very responsible, or they're irresponsible? And it may be a kind of mixture of both, because the world isn't divided into straightforward lines like that, and companies change over time. And of course, organisations are made up of people, and as humans, we're flawed. And it's often, in my view, not about some of the things that happened so much, what was the intention behind it? You know, was there a real intent to defraud? Was there a real intent to actually mislead or to destroy vast acres of the landscape in which we live. So maybe have a think about some of those companies. And it's quite interesting how the students get involved in quite fierce debates, particularly when I ask them to think about Microsoft and Apple and what, which of, the two. And of course, famously, Microsoft founders spend vast amounts of money and vast time at their own expense to try and eliminate things like malaria. And Steve Jobs, who most of the students seem to think is the hero, said, "What did I give to the world? I gave them Apple." That was his kind of view of life. And so you might find, if you look at some of the tables about unethical companies, there's at least 3 of those that regularly occur in the top 3 of the most unethical companies. And there's 2 or 3 that appear regularly in the most ethical companies. And that's for you to think about, really, of what you have in your own mind. And part of the problem that we see with some of the irresponsibility has been when companies, or when kind of market economics, which we've been kind of driven by in business schools of teaching as well, takes over from considerations in other things in our lives and our planet, so that the markets drive what happens to the natural environment, and whether that's destruction, or whether that's changing communities or taking away communities, or whether that's an effect on individuals and different places in the world. Not all companies, and some of the ones I've mentioned before, and I'll come on to make comments. I've included this because it's a recent thing, and I suppose investors have not been as public and as open about supporting sustainability in the same way that other businesses have. And, I work with a lot of companies through the Global Compact, UN engagement with businesses, and there's lots of companies in and around, here and in the UK that are doing amazing things on sustainability. And you will have had a leaflet about an event we've got in a week or so's time on the Sustainable Development Goals that I'd like you all to come to, because there's some great examples of local businesses and global businesses doing that. But this was really seen as quite a turning point in terms of some of that, although there are other kind of key investment companies that have been ahead of this, I suppose. And I couldn't really have a lecture like this about my life and my work without including Sir Adrian Cadbury. I worked with him for 10 years at Aston. He was the Chancellor, and he was also a co-tutor with me on the MBA Ethics, Responsibility and Sustainability module. But he's such a humble man. He used to refer to himself as my teaching assistant. But he was responsible for the Cadbury report, chairing the Cadbury Committee on governance, and went on to advise 38 countries around the world on governance, and also had very simple messages about corporate social responsibility. And those 3 things that he saw as the key tenets were: you treat your employees well, you make goods and services ethically and that people want and are distributed, whatever, ethically as well. And the final thing that he was absolutely adamant about was that you pay your taxes into the communities in which you operate so that they benefit from your involvement there. And if you think back to the logos, there are some that didn't on that list, or don't maybe still. But it's no point just saying that businesses need to step up, because lots of businesses have, as we said, and there are many people I am in absolute awe of in terms of their responsibility. By the way, the quote from Adrian that you read on the screen was that you may know that it was taken over by Kraft, and his very pertinent remark that I said businesses change, and you can't necessarily, you can buy the business, but you can't buy the values and the character of the business. And the family were no longer involved, and that was one of the saddest days I've ever seen Adrian, because he was actually at Aston on that day that happened. But going back to this about it's our fault, who do I mean by it's our fault? Well, of course, it's also educators' fault, because what have we been doing for the last 50 years? We've been hooked on particular types of business and management education, particularly. And this came sharply into focus at the time of the 2008 crash, when these were the kind of headlines that we had around the world. Accusing business academics of neglecting their responsibilities towards having new types of business education. And summed up by Ken Starkey, who said, leading business schools need to develop a different language and a new narrative to legitimise their function and overcome their fascination with a particular form of economics, finance and economics, and broaden their intellectual horizons, which is an important thing. And this is actually what Prime has done, has tried to grasp that and look at how we can challenge that. And I know from the start of the business school here with Neil in 2008 that Prime became the framework for how business would be taught in the business school. And there's many great colleagues in the audience who are doing an enormous, fantastic job in different subjects, different areas to do that. So I said I'd talk a little bit about my life and my values, my work, my inspiration. My gosh, goodness, that seems like a tall order now I look at it. But I love the quote from Hugo Hamilton, because you carry your history with you. And this is my story, but it's a story that many people have, a very similar story to the one I'm going to talk about. Because I'm not alone in the kind of start in life I had, which was brilliant. Fantastic parents. My mother's still alive at 85 and still fighting, as my daughter in the audience will testify to. And such an amazing, woman. And so was my father. They gave me a sense of justice, a sense of fairness, of honesty and integrity, which were their core values all the time growing up. This picture, by the way, I don't know if anyone knows what that is, but it's Spitfires, because I grew up on a council estate that was built on an airfield that was used during the Second World War, and the car factory my father worked in was where they used to make the Spitfires, and it makes Jaguars today. So that's kind of from that era. But one of the other things that I had as a child was that my parents would take us, they didn't have the money to go on holiday abroad, but we went every couple of times a year on holiday, different places, and we always went to the library every week. And there I saw that there were different things in life and different ways of living and different ways of thinking about things that were important to my father and my family. So on to my career. It kind of might seem a strange route, that I was busy kind of recruiting like mad in the health service people and opening a new hospital with transferring 650 staff from different hospitals and recruiting 650 for new posts in the West Midlands, and then working for Sainsbury's and doing all those kind of things. But actually, as far as human resources and working in it, it just reinforced to me the importance of fairness and justice. And when I was charged with leading a contracting out process in the NHS for hotel services, it was absolutely critical that we had a good in-house tender against all these kind of very determined competitors that would actually stand up to the scrutiny and be both quality and economically viable for that. And so in human resources, I also like the academic Karen Legg, who talks about human resources professionals being deviant innovators. We shouldn't just follow the model of trying to be more accountants. Apologies to the accountants in the audience, you're great and I love you all. But human resources have particular skills and particular qualities to bring, and trying to look at the business from a different point of view. If you look at those logos again in your mind, or think about companies, our identity is often wrapped up in sometimes where we work and who we are, because often the first question people say to you when they meet you is, what's your name, is what do you do? And it's interesting, as studies have shown, that people who are proud of where they work will say, I work at X company. Those who are less proud will say, oh, I'm in IT, or I work in finance or something. because they don't identify necessarily with the values. And then, so for me, it wasn't such a big leap to go into kind of business ethics, because it was where my kind of soul was in a sense. And so when I was working at the University of Wolverhampton, and the person who gave me my first job in University of Wolverhampton is in the audience, actually. So it was your fault, really, that I kind of ended up doing all this. And so working, I was at Wolverhampton managing everything in sight, you know, the department, the courses, I ended up managing the QAA process and all kinds of things. And then I was busy helping other people to do their PhDs and research, and I thought, I need to do this. And when an opportunity came up at the University of Aston University, I went there. And again, I started managing all the courses and managing everything. But I thought I'd got a master's in occupational psychology, and it was a psychology-driven kind of HR place. And so they were convincing me that I needed to do a PhD in psychology. And within 18 months, I realised I'd made the biggest mistake of my life, because I was doing what you should not do with a PhD. I was actually following someone else's research pattern. I wasn't living the dream and the passion that I had. So I can remember lying in the bath one night thinking, I can't do this anymore. I've got to do what I really care about. And so I'd been working by that time with the Birmingham Centre for Business Ethics, which Sir Adrian was the president of, with businesses. And we developed all kinds of case studies about businesses and the ethical problems, and used them with students. And I'd met someone from Birmingham University who ran the Centre for Global Ethics and Human Rights. And so I talked to her, and she said, well, you don't really know anything about human rights. So I enrolled myself on master's programmes over the summer in human rights and global ethics at Birmingham University, so I could start with her. Then she decided to up and leave to another university, so I had to kind of start again, because I thought, no, I found her, I can't sort of change again. So that's how I ended up there. But in Aston, although I started in human resources, a lot of my work, I ran a final year module, it was called Contemporary Issues. And it was all about ethical stuff and gradually about sustainability and things like this, because those are the things I saw as the contemporary issues. And then I had the opportunity to contribute to the MBA. And there was going to be a core module. This is 2003. And there were very few modules and MBA programs in this country, let alone in the world, that had ethics as the core of their program. And I went along thinking I might contribute something to do with the Business Ethics Centre or whatever. And I came away leading that module because everyone else wanted to do it as an accounting module, a reporting module, a law module, or whatever. And I felt it needed to have an interdisciplinarity about it, including ecology and other things. So that's what we did. Then I became Director of Social Responsibility for the business school, and then for the university, working with other disciplines. And during that time was the time that Prime really took off. And in my role in the chapter and role in the poverty group and so on, which I'll talk about, came up. So in a sense, I was driven towards the agenda and sustainability through the kind of lens of business ethics and justice in that sense. So the challenges that we face, very clear. We talk about social, economic and environmental, and that business as usual is no longer an option. And our greatest challenge is trying to improve human existence for all in the context of this resources and carbon-constrained planet. And what's at stake? Well, this is a famous photograph that you've probably all seen and all know, the Blue Marble as it's called, that was taken by the Apollo 17 astronauts in 1972. And it was the first time I actually saw the Earth in its full magnificence. And then when you think about it, the only thing that we have from outside of the Earth is sunlight. All the resources that we have, all the precious metals, all the other things, are already on that planet. And as we're excavating them and taking them up and then burning fossil fuels into the atmosphere, we're trying to destroy the planet. How many elements does a smartphone have? About 60 odd of these precious elements from the Earth. And only 10% of mobile phones are actually recycled. We do amazing things to our planet. The plastic waste, I haven't got time to go into, there's the deforestation, the desertification, so many things that challenge us. And the fossil fuels particularly, because there are fantastic work being done. And the 2013 IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, agreed 97% of the scientists agreed that there was a human factor in climate change. And yet we still have people being funded to deny that, you know, there's any change in what's happening, even though we have the greatest expert, and some having death threats, as we know from things. So I thought I'd just show you this, which is a very powerful film.
So let's get to work. We're calling this Do the Math, and we're going to do some math for a moment. Just 3 numbers, okay? I wrote about them in a piece last summer for Rolling Stone, a piece that went oddly viral. It was the issue with Justin Bieber on the cover, okay? But here's the strange thing. The next day, I got a call from the editor saying, your piece has gotten 10 times more likes on Facebook than Justin Bieber's, you know? Some of that is doubtless the result of my sort of soulful stare, you know? But mostly it's because we managed to just kind of lay out this math in a very straightforward way that people needed to understand as we were going through what turned out to be the hottest year that America has ever experienced. Before we get to those 3 numbers, here's where we are so far. We've burned enough coal and gas and oil to raise the temperature of the Earth 1 degree. What has that done? There was a day last September when the headline in the paper was, half the polar ice cap is missing. Literally. I mean, if Neil Armstrong were up on the moon today, he would look down and see half as much area of ice in the Arctic. We've taken one of the largest physical features on Earth and we have broken it. Shall we work through the numbers? They're 3 and they're easy. The first one's 2 degrees. That's how much the world has said it would be safe to let the planet warm. In political terms, it's the only thing that anybody's agreed to. Some of you may remember that climate summit in Copenhagen. There was only one number in the final 2-page voluntary accord that people signed. Only one number in it, 2 degrees. Every signatory pledged to make sure the temperature wouldn't rise above that. The EU, Japan, Russia, China, countries that make their money selling oil like the United Arab Emirates, the most conservative, recalcitrant, reluctant countries on Earth, even the United States. If the world officially believes anything about climate change, it's that 2 degrees is too much. Second number, scientists have calculated how much carbon we could pour into the atmosphere and have a reasonable chance of staying below 2 degrees. They say about 565 more gigatons. A gigaton is 1 billion tons. That's not a perfect chance. That's worse odds than Russian roulette, you know. It sounds like it should be a lot. It is a lot. 565 billion tons of CO2. The problem is we pour 30 billion tons a year in now, and it goes up 3% a year. Do the math, and it's about 15 years before we go past that threshold. So that's sobering news. But the scary number is the third number. The third number was the important one and the new one, and it came from a team of financial analysts in the United Kingdom. And what they did was sit down with all the annual reports and SEC filings and things and figure out how much carbon the world's fossil fuel industry, how much they had already in their reserves. And that number turned out to be 2,795 gigatons worth of carbon. 5 times as much as the most conservative governments on Earth think would be safe to pour into the atmosphere. It's not even close. I mean, it's 5 times more. And once you know that number, then you understand the essence of this problem.
Sorry, technical hitch. So going back to those circles I said before, one of the things that Judge talks about and lends on Gaia theory is about talking about the human aspect of this influence on climate change, and that we cannot make the world sustainable. The Earth will go on. What we're seeing now is some of the step changes in what's happening in terms of the Earth adjusting. But it will continue. It is sustainable. But whether with us or without us, that's the question. and with all people on the planet, you know, in the low-lying areas in some of the islands and Bangladesh and other places that are subject to catastrophe with sea level rises and other things. So we need to think about, you know, that we need the planet. You know, you've all heard, if we continue consuming and using resources and burning fossil fuels the way that we are, that we'll need the UK in 50 years' time, 3 planets worth of resources. And the US is between 6 and 7 planets. And however much, you know, Richard Branson and other people are trying to escape to go to other places, it's not really going to happen, and certainly not in my lifetime. So we need to take care of the natural environment, we need to take care of and have the markets and the economy service those communities and that natural environment, and not have things the other way around. That's an afterthought in terms of how we think about things. So what do we do in Prime? And these you can look at in detail. But it's about teaching, it's about research, it's about the values that we convey to our students, and it's about partnering with other organisations, including businesses, to effect that, and having dialogues with partners. The reason I've actually got the statement highlighted there is that there used to be, when the principles were agreed, a statement underneath saying, oh, and we'll incorporate these into our organisations as well. It was a kind of like an afterthought. And one of the things I was passionate about on the advisory committee of Prime was pushing for this. And in the 10th anniversary, we actually got agreement that it would be part of the principles. What does that mean? It means the university as a signatory to Prime not only have to say about what they teach to others and but how they incorporate into their own organisations and their own organisational practices as part of that. So Prime is a kind of global organisation. We now have over 700 signatories in 83 countries. And the role that I have in terms of working with the chapter in the UK has actually been working, developing and helping the chapters around the world. Sorry about the chapters thing. It makes me sound like I'm a Hell's Angel. But it's... But it's the term, you know, for the regional chapters, as it were. So, and I've been working with many of the chairs of those chapters in terms of the governance and setting things up over the last. And I was in Beirut in October at the MENA, Middle East and North Africa chapter, and in Switzerland. But don't worry, Joy, I don't spend all my time travelling around. A lot of it's by conference call and so on. But it is an important thing. The 90% communicating means those are the universities that are actually up to date with their reports on what they're doing and actually making sure that they're on target with what they plan to do. One of the things we did for the special issue is I edited with 2 colleagues a special issue on Prime, and there are copies in the foyer and some leaflets about that. But if you want to know more about Prime and you don't, there's lots of, you see this is quite a bumper edition, and Neil is the editor-in-chief for this journal. And we were very pleased with it, particularly when we saw the amount of downloads this special issue had only 4 months after its edition, which means that people are taking this seriously and actually wanting to read it. But there are articles about the last 10 years, but importantly about the Sustainable Development Goals and where we are. And it was important as we were going through the process of editing this, because during the time we were editing, we had Brexit and then we had Trump elected. And, you know, that's what kind of came to mind with my, you know, kind of what's going on in the world. In fact, I was at the UN in both occasions, once in New York and once in Switzerland. And I walked into a meeting in New York with the only person from the UK, apart from someone who's from Scotland, who immediately said, well, we didn't vote for it. And so everyone, the 24 of the people in the room were saying, so what have you done? Why have you done this? And what's going to happen? So when it happened again, when we were in another meeting, we decided we should stop meeting, really, because this was obviously a trigger to some of the things that were going on in the world. It's as good as conspiracy theory as any, that's what I would say. So the agenda that we embrace, we talked about the principles of how we do this, and what we do is actually about the Sustainable Development Goals, which were agreed by all members of the United Nations, and we have 192 members, and we have the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I was actually invited to represent Prime as part of the Prime Champions Group in the General Assembly with Ban Ki-moon, and there were other speakers from the Global Compact and the Principles of Responsible Investment, multiple, and then I was the only person. It kind of shows how education is ranked in kind of those settings. But I was the warm-up act for Ban Ki-moon, which was kind of claim to fame, I suppose. But I was so determined I had to get this right. I only had, you know, so many minutes in which to speak. And so I was determined to do that in a way that conveyed the message. And Ban Ki-moon, when he rose to his feet, quoted something I said. And I thought, he actually listened and he actually thought that. He wasn't so interested in, either he didn't remember what they'd said or that was something that was important. But what he was saying then is that we're not going to end up with 17 goals, but the politics of the UN mean that there are. And there are some that are not there, you know, that they're hidden within them. There's kind of complexity about it. But the great thing is we have a clear agenda that the world has agreed to. When the Millennium Development Goals were agreed in 2000, it was only governments that were interested. Now we have all agents in society, businesses and education and civil society and, you know, interested in those. In the journal, and I'd urge you to have a look at this because one of the articles tries to look at those sustainable development goals per country. And if you just go into the gap frame on the website and you'll find maps where they've used all publicly available data to try and work out on those 17 goals where different countries are. So you can draw up any and I know Roz, who's, sorry, can't be here tonight, but she uses this with her master's students and they do an analysis of their country, of how they're doing. And that's the world. So that, you know, there's another kind of 190 maps that you can have a look at. But it's a great way of thinking about it. And we've got another paper going through the process at the moment on the methodology behind this for the journal. But, you know, that's one thing I would recommend. I said the other thing I wanted to talk about was education. And those are some of the points from the Goal 4, because the key to the Sustainable Development Goals and bringing them together is actually about having an agenda for education. And that influences all the other goals and brings them together. And particularly the last thing, which is about that learners acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development. And that's echoed in terms of their support for that from having all agents in society that Ban Ki-moon talked about. And then the new Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, talked about, you know, Prime being one of those important initiatives as part of that. So at Winchester, I said we're an early adopter of Prime and a Prime champion and transforming management education through the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you go up to West End, you'll see the Sustainable Development Goals in physical form hanging in the Link Gallery, which is a great reminder to people about what they are. And of course, now that Joy referred to, we're working with the National Union of Students, and it's great to see Quinn here, because we're working on different aspects, not only the formal curriculum, the informal on-campus stuff, and also what we said about primes, the change about organisational practices, and there's some great examples of that going on here at Winchester in organisational practices. So, and one of the things that we know is that we cannot expect yesterday's teaching to prepare today's students for tomorrow's future. You know, we need to find different ways of thinking about it. Some of the more complex issues that we're dealing with require maybe different approaches and different ways of thinking about that. So the final topic I want to raise with you from the Sustainable Development Goals is about poverty. And it's the number one Sustainable Development Goal. Doesn't mean it's any more important than the others. In fact, the only one that has an urgent action flagged on it is climate change. But they're all important. But poverty was the number one Millennium Development Goal. And there was a great shift in the Global South in terms of changing the lives of people. And there were significant numbers of communities where people lifted out of poverty with some of the things that happened with the Millennium. But the Sustainable Development Goals is about both hemispheres, about the Global South and the Global North, and we talk about absolute poverty as well as relative poverty that we see in developed communities, including our own. And I'm part of this working group. We set up 6 of us in a room thinking we need to find out whether poverty and inclusion is part of the agenda. This was back in 2010. So we did what all academics do. We did a survey. So we surveyed 450 business schools around the world and found that less than 50 incorporated any aspect of poverty. Every one of them included wealth creation in theirs, but none of them talked about inclusion and poverty. And so we produced this report. And then we decided to provide some materials because a lot of academics say, we'd like to do it, but we don't know how. So we edited the first book, which is about what the challenge of poverty is and socially responsible organisations, and lots of really good examples of both education but also business organisations addressing that. And then we followed that up with different ways of teaching, but you can't do this in the standard way. And then we had a collection of best practices from management education. Because one of my kind of favourite quotes from David Orr, who some of you may know is a great environmentalist, said, "It's worth noting that the destruction of the planet and its people is not the work of people who are those who are not educated. It is rather the work of people with bachelors and masters and MBAs and PhDs. Education can equip people to be more effective vandals of the earth and its peoples. If one listens carefully," he says, "each spring, it is possible to hear the earth and its peoples groan every time another smart, well-intentioned, degree-holding graduates, but sustainability illiterate, are eager to succeed, are launched into the biosphere." So in terms of the way we think about it, it's education has the power to change things. And that's the thing I think in terms of not only what I'm talking about in poverty, but in education. It is not hopeless, when we see all these kind of things that are going on, because we have the ability to change mindsets. We have the ability to change things about what people do, about behaviours, about actions. And that's a very powerful thing, and we can have small gains that can build into bigger gains, and it's important that we hold on to that. So the survey on poverty that we did, and by the way, we presented at the Rio Earth Summit, and our working group on poverty went from 6 to over 100, and we now have nearly 200 people, including Martina, who's in the audience, and we're doing a symposium on this with people from around the world shortly. But we did another survey 5 years on to find out whether things had changed. And there has been some shift, but still not enough. It is still predominantly wealth creation and market economics that dominate and that squeeze out some of these things. Even questions about whether it's legitimate to talk about poverty in business schools. And this is the current kind of survey. We're currently with 58 countries in 7 languages, including Chinese, Arabic, Serbo-Croat, kind of a whole range of things that we do. But we've got a whole bunch of challenges that remain. And, I can send you reports and things. So the last couple of minutes, I just want to talk about a project that was very close to my heart. There's a box of chocolates for anyone who knows where that is, but not my family. Yeah, that is the wonderful and beautiful city of Birmingham. More canals than Venice, and I actually worked with a group of students who made a video which is available on YouTube called More Canals Than Venice. We have more trees than Paris. I won't go on. That's the beautiful city of Birmingham. And in 2012, we hosted the competitors from Jamaica, including Usain Bolt at Birmingham University, and the American team. And the city was full of kind of celebration. The year before, however, it had been a very different story, because you may recall that in 2011, there were riots in London, or what were called riots. And these were the pictures that went around the world from Birmingham at that time. And when we look at those images, by the way, this happened for less than a day. But if you look on the news media, you'd think it happened for 3 weeks, because those images are permanent, and that's the way that it's seen. In the various reports that were brought out at the time, there were lots of thoughts about why this had happened. People with no stake in society, people who didn't feel it mattered whether they actually smashed up shops and took things, because they had no role in that. These big glass ivory towers with all the big firms in the centre of Birmingham weren't for them. What did it matter to them if they weren't part of that society? And so we had various reports on that, but, looting fueled by social exclusion, and poor estates, nothing to lose. This is not excusing, this is trying to understand. And the businesses in the city were very worried, because this was also about security and, how we live our lives and the kind of communities we have. So a generation bred on diet of excessive consumerism, bombarded by advertising, had been unleashed, is what was concluded in this article. Whereas we used to be defined by what we did, we're now defined by what we buy. And that was one of the things that came from that. So what happened in Birmingham? The Bishop of Birmingham, who I kind of worked with through a group of the industrial chaplains that I was part of at one point, working with council for looking at, they have chaplains in all kinds of businesses in Birmingham. But he set up with a cross-party and cross-group, all the agents in Birmingham came together for this social cohesion challenge and giving hope, changing life. And I was asked to be one of the leaders of the inclusive economic growth. How can we ensure that everyone shares in the growth and the prosperity and the role of business in that? And there were other streams, the other five are there. So, and just to understand something about a city like Birmingham, it's a super diverse city, is its title, and people have travelled there and settled there very happily and very engaged and integrated in the life and soul of the city from 187 countries. But there's also great deprivation, but in certain areas, if you look, the indices on deprivation has changed very little over that period of time, and those kind of dark areas are the same wards in the same city. And 40% of Birmingham's population lived in the 10 most deprived city in England. And it's one of the frightening things, and more we learnt about what was happening in Birmingham, was that there's a train that goes across Birmingham, and depending where you get off, your life expectancy goes down by 10 years in those wards. So what did we do in this economic? So this was about not just education in terms of the confines of the university, it's actually about our role in society and in the communities in which we live. And so the challenge for the business group was actually, how do we make a difference? And there are a whole range of initiatives, some of them are fairly obvious, but things like, we had this project, 10,000 opportunities. That was to create work experience, placements, apprenticeships, training programs, and we had a collaboration of small and medium-sized businesses and the big companies in Birmingham as part of this, because people have been so shocked at what had happened in the previous years, and we had a lot of cooperation, and we achieved that target. The City Council at the time also, the transport, for many people, they couldn't get to a job interview because Birmingham was built for the car. And so to actually get there, it's very difficult to kind of navigate. And so they actually provided free bus passes for young people to be able to go to job interviews and clothes for interviews. And there was a whole range of initiatives there that were important. I said about inspiration, some of the inspiration people I've had. The trouble is, I've got a few photographs of when I've met Ban Ki-moon, and he's one of my heroes. But I always feel like I've photoshopped it, or I'm stalking him, and including that one. So we were actually having a conversation, and then I kind of saw the camera and looked, and he didn't. So it looks like, oh, she just moved in on him. Anyway. I don't know if you know this guy, Mohammed Yunus, who set up credit microfinance in Bangladesh and created light in lots of villages by using solar energy instead of the very dangerous kerosene lamps, and he's a Nobel Prize winner. And this guy, I mentioned my PhD work was on human rights. This is John Ruggie, one of my heroes. He actually developed the framework for the business engagement, because part of the problem with human rights is that it belongs to, where's David, our lawyer, friendly lawyer. It's nation states that have responsibility, not kind of, companies are not accountable. So he was actually instrumental in bringing, and things like the Rana Plaza disaster that Savitri will be well versed, and the students here from Fashion Song of the companies, the fashion companies, where 13 people died and there was enormous tragedy in Bangladesh a few years ago. And people have kind of headlines about which company were involved, but it was all of the major fashion retailers. And 2 years on, there was one major company that had still not paid any compensation. That wonderful United Colours of Benetton had still not paid until there was a Facebook campaign. In 3 weeks, they paid up their £2 million for compensation. Don't know whether, I think I would have a big prize for that if anyone knows who the person in the top is. That's a woman called Tererai Trent from Zimbabwe. Look her up. She is amazing. She had no education because boys have education. She had to learn from her brother. She was married at 13. and had 3 children to an abusive husband. And her dream was to go to America and be educated, and she did. And if you read her story, you'll know why. Having met her, I can't talk about it without thinking kind of very emotional things. So this is a kind of mantra I live with. I kind of feel like I can't just talk about it and teach it. I have to kind of be involved in it, and it's important that we do that. And that's why I think, there are 3 things I often say to students, and I talk about we all have a sphere of influence. It doesn't matter where we are. It doesn't matter whether it's in a part-time job we've got or a hobby we've got. We have a sphere of influence amongst the people we speak to and the people that we interact with. And whether, now, I'm involved in some global issues. I never imagined that when I was back on the council estate when I was 11 and thinking about whether I should go to grammar school or not. And so everyone has the opportunity to do that. And it's a challenge for each one of us to find how we can make that difference. The other 2 things I would say is that serendipity plays a part. How did I end up doing what I'm doing? Well, some of it was kind of happened to be somewhere where something was going on. Like the poverty group. I joined a conversation at a conference and we ended up developing the survey. And the other thing is, and the final thing is about authenticity. And that applies to companies. I said, what's the intent of companies when they're engaged in these issues? Are they being authentic? Are they greenwashing? Are they trying it as a PR stunt? If it's real and it's part of the DNA of the organisation, just like here at Winchester with its values and the way it works, then it's important for us as individuals to carry that with us as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Carole Parks, Professor and Great British Bake Off contender. Before my vote of thanks to Carole, on behalf of the University, I would also like to thank Richard Tigger-Hoare for his support of the Business School and the Hoare Centre for Responsible Management. I'm delighted that Tigger and Francis have been able to join us this evening. Thank you. When I joined the university in 2007, to develop a business school, the PRIME initiative was also launched. I took a look at the initiative and I realised that PRIME accorded so well with the university's values and, on a business sense, was also an excellent way to differentiate the business school in a new, saturated market here in the southeast of England. Some people, when I came here, thought I was mad to try and start a business school because there was so many business schools in the local area. But it's comforting to know that young people are engaging with the PRIME initiative and are attracted to study in Winchester in their droves. We're about 20% of the total students in the university now. As Carle's outlined, the challenges faced by the developed and developing world are all covered by PRIME. That is why all students at the University of Winchester Business School receive a module in responsible management in their first semester with us, undergrad or postgrad. It provides a critical lens to challenge traditional business thinking during the rest of their studies. It helps provide the quality education, SDG 4, on which the Sustainable Development Goals are underpinned, and we are proud to be involved in producing sustainably literate graduates. By being fully engaged in the PRIME initiative, the university is educating a new generation of business leaders to respond positively to the challenges faced by the modern world. As Carole rightly pointed out, we are also operating as a responsible organisation by leading by example in reducing our carbon footprint and being careful in our use of scarce natural resources. We are also a living wage signatory, helping to take low pay and poverty out of the local economy. So not only are we a champion school, but we have our own academic champion, Professor Carole Parks. It's a great pleasure to have you as a committed and talented colleague. Thank you, and please join me in congratulating you on your inaugural lecture this evening.